If you've ever played a popular gacha game, a mobile game where you spend currency to roll for characters or equipment like Genshin Impact or Wuthering Waves or Nikke or Blue Archive, you may have noticed something quite peculiar. Despite being developed by Chinese and Korean developers, these games all appear, at first glance, to be Japanese. What do I mean? Consider Genshin Impact. Genshin is developed by MiHoYo, a Chinese company whose name, we will later see, directly borrows from Japanese culture. The name Genshin itself is a specifically Japanese pronunciation of the game's Chinese name, Ren-Sin, meaning original god. Genshin, Ren-Sin. Genshin was also the name of an important monk and historical figure in the Tendai school of Japanese Mahayana Buddhism, but let's not get into that or we'll be here forever. The important takeaway is that Genshin was developed in China, but it markets itself to the world using Japanese aesthetics. Aesthetic here as defined by the Cambridge Dictionary, meaning the particular style of appearance that something has. MiHoYo's other big hit is Honkai Star Rail. Honkai is an anglicization of Hokkai, which itself is a Japanese transliteration of the game's Chinese name Benghuai, which means collapse. Hokkai, Honkai, Benghuai. The precursor game to Star Rail is Honkai Impact III. Honkai Impact doesn't even have English voice acting. The game is voice acted only in Chinese and Japanese. But for a more dramatic example, let's look at Blue Archive. Blue Archive. Blue Archive was developed by Nexon Games of South Korea and was produced by Kim Yong-ha, a Korean. The game first released in Japan with Japanese voice acting before the global release came a year later. And it wasn't even published in Japan by a Japanese publisher, it was published by Yoastar, a Chinese company based in Shanghai. Despite all of that, the game presents itself as completely Japanese in its art and marketing. Yoastar also published the gacha game Azure Lane, the Ship Girl game. No, not that one. That's the Japanese one. Azure Lane is the Chinese one. Azure Lane released in China in May of 2017 and subsequently in Japan in September of 2017. Despite being a Chinese game released first in China, the game's voice acting has Japanese options. The game presents itself as Japanese in its title and marketing, and indeed, the game proved to be quite a hit in Japan, which bolstered its credibility when it hit the global market in May of 2019. But why? Why would games made in Korea or China market themselves using Japanese aesthetics instead of their own? Especially when in both South Korea and China, Japanese media has historically been censored or restricted due to fears of cultural imperialism. Well, at first glance, the answer seems obvious. There's an enormous international audience of otaku and weebs, Japanophiles of the geeky variety, who are more likely to trust or even exclusively engage with media if it looks Japanese. Anime and manga are extremely popular. The market for gacha games is massive in Japan, and Japan is a world leader in soft power, which is the ability to influence others through culture and appeal rather than force. So of course, you'd want to borrow that for your own game, right? Well, it's not that simple. While the use of Japanese aesthetics might seem like harmless marketing, in truth, this behavior is much more complex than one might think, with many moving parts. It is the product of geopolitical strategy designed to appropriate not just appearances, but the very foundations of soft power. For you see, the anime aesthetic is not just a style. It and the cultural context it carries is a commodified product of post-war Japan. One that successfully packages and sells authenticity so effectively that it has now been co-opted and re-exported by the very nations that once tried to keep it out. Let us look together then at how anime developed its uniquely resonant emotional grammar. How that emerged in part from Japan's navigation of second-wave feminism, how that authenticity came to be industrialized and then mobilized for the purposes of soft power, and finally, how gacha games and other media from China, Korea, and beyond have weaponized that soft power to fuel cultural industries and geopolitical ambitions, even as Japan's global influence continues to fade. It's a long story with a lot of context, but I think you'll enjoy it. I'm Mooney, and you are tuned into Moon Channel. About a month ago, I was traveling abroad where I recorded some footage for the next few videos. Take a look at this footage here. It's cherry blossom season and festivities are in full swing. There are cute decorations everywhere, cultural performances going on, little wind chimes tied to trees. It's a mesmerizingly beautiful sight, isn't it? Well, let me ask you, dear viewer, where am I? Where did I film this footage? I'll give you a hint. It's not Japan. Have you guessed yet? Well, this footage was taken in the People's Republic of China in the city of Wuxi. Now, Wushi's cherry blossoms are of a Japanese varietal. They were first planted by Hasegawa Kiyomi, who served in the Japanese Imperial Army, but who wanted to make amends by planting sakura trees in Wuxi about 37 years ago, with the intention of fostering friendly relations between China and Japan. Indeed, while I was there, the Japanese ambassador to China, Kanasugi Kenji, traveled all the way to Wuxi from Beijing in order to take part in a friendship ceremony, where Japanese and Chinese performers took the stage to perform together. It's an inspiring sight, isn't it? Japan and China putting aside historical grievances to join hands in harmony. The bridging of that divide and the foreign policies of both countries has actually been underway for the better part of a decade now, but that's outside of the scope of this video and maybe a topic for another day. And no, it's not just current events as of the publication of this video that are spurring this reconciliation, though as you might imagine, it has indeed accelerated the process. But I digress. What I want you to really pay attention to in these videos is the architecture. Remember, this is all in China, and yet you may have recognized this architectural style as being distinctly Japanese. This is a Chinese pagoda I filmed during the same trip on Turtle Island. It's in the architectural style of the late Ming, maybe early Qing dynasty by my reckoning, though I'm no expert in Chinese architecture. Compare the pagoda you just saw to this famous Japanese pagoda, the 5-storied pagoda at Horyuji in Nara. You can see that the first pagoda from the initial footage in China looks much more like the pagoda in Horyuji than it does the later Ming/Qing pagoda. But what if I told you that the architectural style you're looking at in the original footage was not intended to be Japanese at all, at least not on paper? The architecture you're looking at is ostensibly Tang Dynasty Chinese architecture. The Tang Dynasty was a Chinese golden age of sorts, and it was during this period that China exported much of its culture to Japan, which the Japanese thereafter preserved and maintained, in a manner of speaking. This pagoda here is Japan's oldest 3-storied pagoda, located at Hokiji, also in Nara. It was built in Japan in the year 706 during the Tang Dynasty, just after the death of Empress Wu Zetian. Here is a surviving Tang Dynasty pagoda, the Shumi Pagoda, located in Hebei, China. It was built in the year 636 AD, about 70 years before the construction of the Japanese pagoda we just saw. It survived because it was built of stone and brick, and thus the overall style looks a bit different than the wooden pagoda of Theseus that is the 3-storied pagoda at Hokiji. But the resemblance between this Tang pagoda and the Japanese pagodas we've seen are obvious when we compare them to the Ming/Qing pagoda. The Tang-style pagodas are square, like the Japanese pagodas, and the Ming/Qing pagoda is octagonal. Which brings us back to our initial footage. The architectural style you're looking at is ostensibly Tang Dynasty architecture, but in China, the ability to build and maintain Tang-style architecture has largely been lost, whereas in Japan, it has been maintained for over a millennium. And the end result is, in trying to reconstruct this Tang Dynasty sort of Buddhist retreat, what we get is a Japanese town complete with a Japanese pagoda, Japanese cherry blossoms, and even tatami rooms. Here's a photo of the room I stayed in. This is not Chinese. This is very evidently Japanese. Tang architecture was exported from China to Japan, kept in Japan, and then reintroduced back to China from Japan. The cherry blossom tree itself is another testament to this behavior. It is also native to China, specifically to the Himalayas. This photo I'm showing you is a bell blossom. It is the original cherry blossom tree from which all the others are derived. And yet, all of the cherry blossom trees you're looking at in these videos are all Japanese cultivars. The sakura was brought to Japan from China, bred and cultivated in Japan to become what we know today, and then reintroduced back into China and the world. And by proxy, when we observe a cherry blossom festival in China that seems Japanese, we are not just witnessing mimicry, we are watching over a millennium of cultural interaction and exchange folding back in on itself. Which is to say, the aesthetics of Japan and China, and also Korea, though I elected to cut that segment for brevity's sake, are interconnected and interrelated at a very fundamental level, and where one aesthetic begins and another ends is not always clear. Each East Asian country borrows a great deal from the others, though they might be loath to admit it, and what is true for architecture and horticulture is also true for pop culture and aesthetics as a whole. And in the present, the place where pop culture and East Asian aesthetics most readily intersect is, in my opinion, anime, manga, and video games. A dynamic which can only be fully understood by contextualizing it from the roots. So let us go back and review our anime history one more time, but with perhaps a different lens than we've used in prior videos, to see if we can't build a firm foundation for our understanding. The history of anime is a topic I've discussed before, but not within the context of cultural cross-pollination. Although I'm tempted to reach back in time and discuss how Japanese, Chinese, and even Korean art each drew inspiration from the others throughout history, we'll cut that for brevity's sake as well, and start more simply with France. In December of 1888, French artist Charles-Émile Renaud patented an invention called the praxinoscope, a projector of sorts that wound two long strips of transparent colored pictures between two spools. Think of it like a film projector, but instead of film, it's drawn pictures. Well, after inventing and patenting the praxinoscope, Renaud took his device on the road and put on over 12,800 animated shows to an audience of over 500,000 people. And it was the popularity of Renaud's shows that led to the proliferation of drawn animation on film and eventually to the growth of animation industries around the globe. The first Japanese animation that we know of was something of an imitation of these Western printed film strips. It's called Katsuro Shashin, and it was produced sometime between 1907 and 1912. Animation was readily embraced in Japan, and by the late 1910s and early 1920s, Japanese animations such as Junichi Koichi's Namakura Gatana were already being shown in theaters. This might all sound very familiar to you. We've discussed this history before on Moon Channel, and I'm sure other The History of Anime videos on other channels have covered it by now as well. But what is not as often discussed is that Japan was not the only pioneer in animation in East Asia. And just like how Japan and China have influenced each other when it comes to architecture or clothing, so too did they influence each other in early animation. Consider, for example, the first animated short produced in China, Uproar in the Studio. It was a surprisingly sophisticated animation running 10 to 12 minutes in black and white. Uproar in the Studio was published by Great Wall Film Company and was produced by the four Wan brothers, Wan Lai-ming, Wan Guchang, Wan Chao-chen, and Wan Di-huan, of which Wan Lai-ming is widely recognized as being the father of Chinese animation. The vision of the Wan brothers was simple. They wanted to produce quality animations but with a distinctly Chinese animation style. And to that end, the brothers continued to hone their craft until they released their magnum opus in 1941, right in the middle of World War II, Princess Iron Fan, the first Asian animated feature film. That's right, before Japan had ever released an animated feature film, the Chinese film industry, even while suffering under the terrible conditions of World War II, was developed enough to produce a 73-minute animated film directed and produced by two of the Wan brothers, Wan Guchang and Wan Lai-ming. The story of Princess Iron Fan is a sort of reimagining of a short scene in the famous Chinese novel Journey to the West, in which the Monkey King, Sun Wukong, must persuade Princess Iron Fan to allow them to borrow her fan so that they can cross the Mountain of Flame. And as you can see, the animation is surprisingly sophisticated, with characteristics that we'd later see emerge in animation industries across East and even Southeast Asia. Princess Iron Fan was a monumental achievement in Asian animation, but it was also something of an effective propaganda piece. The underlying message was, if you keep persevering, if you work together, you can walk even through fire and rid the world of calamity. It was a powerful message of endurance and unity that resonated across in Asia, being ravaged by the Japanese Empire. Indeed, it was the success and achievement of Princess Iron Fan, both as a work of art but also as a work of propaganda, that first led the Japanese government to invest its own resources in Japan's homegrown animation industry, which resulted in the release of the propaganda film Momotaro no Umiwashi, or Momotaro's Sea Eagles, in 1943. Momotaro's Sea Eagles is literally a dramatization of the attack on Pearl Harbor, in which Japanese children's folk hero Momotaro leads a naval air squadron and bombs the island of Onigashima, Demon Island. The sequel to Momotaro's Sea Eagles was Japan's first ever feature-length animated film, Momotaro Sacred Sailors, which released in 1945, a full 4 years after Princess Iron Fan. In this film, Momotaro leads the conquest of a primitive island of talking animals and purges them of their savagery by teaching them Japanese, before then proceeding to liberate the island of Celebes from the British. The modern discourse surrounding these films is that they were never intended to be propaganda by the Japanese government. Why, these are films for children, which is, of course, whitewashing atrocity, a popular pastime amongst war crimes denialists in any country, Japan notwithstanding. These films were ordered and funded by the Japanese Naval Ministry to make the Japanese Navy look good. You can attempt to explain away all you like, but the fact of the matter is, Momotaro is bombing Pearl Harbor and culturally eradicating and enslaving Pacific Islanders for forced labor, and both are portrayed as wholesome and worthwhile endeavors. Looking past all the propaganda for a moment though, something curious has happened here. The Momotaro films were heavily inspired by Princess Iron Fan. Everything from the animation style to the propaganda-tinged story to the desire to create said movies came in part from Princess Iron Fan, which itself was produced, as you may recall, with distinctive Chinese characteristics. In other words, the foundations of Japan's modern animation industry, its narrative tropes, techniques, and even its ideological framing were influenced by a Chinese film steeped in Chinese national identity. If you're interested in this topic specifically, by the way, I direct you towards Professor Daisy Yandu's book, An Animated Wartime Encounter, Princess Iron Fan and the Chinese Connection in Early Japanese Animation, an intro snippet of which I've linked for you in the description. The takeaway here is that anime from its roots to its canopy is not an exclusively Japanese product. It's a hybrid, a dynamic interplay between Chinese and Japanese culture and a broad array of external influences. Chinese folklore, Chinese animation techniques, wartime propaganda, and Western narrative structures, to name a few. And it is out of this fusion that anime as we know it emerged. Anime evolved from a tool of state messaging into a deeply personal art form. One that I think is distinctive today for its emotional intensity. Even in its most surreal or fantastical genres, anime has an uncanny ability to touch us. It speaks to us fluently in the languages of such difficult feelings as longing, alienation, nostalgia, frustration, and grief. There can be a disarming earnestness, a rawness to anime that is just starting to seep into the more ironic or sanitized, brand-safe tones of mainstream Western animation that it developed alongside. This emotional authenticity didn't emerge by accident, though. It was shaped by the rapid modernization and rebuilding, by the cultural soul-searching that occurred during Japan's post-war transformation.
I would like to make a film to tell children it's good to be alive. Hayao Miyazaki.
The period leading up to World War II was a time of great cultural upheaval for Japan, which resulted in a new imperial Japanese identity. The Meiji Restoration and the westernization efforts therein merged prevailing Western ideas like nationalism and imperialism into the Japanese political system, resulting in the government-endorsed emperor worship and nationalism of state Shinto, the dominance of the military over matters of the state, and the notion that the Japanese people were superior to all others in the world. But the end of World War II smashed that former Japanese identity into pieces. The victorious United States forced the emperor to renounce his divinity, rewrote the Japanese constitution, and imposed a new political regime and hierarchy. Japan went from an ultra-militarized state to a demilitarized one. The military was dismantled and the massive wartime industries of Japan were disbanded. In the place of the old gods, of empire, Shinto, and the divine right of the emperor, the Japanese people were given a new god to worship by their American occupiers, the almighty dollar. This transformation wasn't just structural or economic, it was ideological. Consumption, capitalism, and market productivity became central to Japan's new national identity. And in the vacuum left behind by spiritual and cultural disintegration, mass media rushed in to fill the void. Out of the rubble of Japan's shattered identity, new forms of expression took shape that valued foremost the exploration of feelings and identity over militaristic or nationalistic domination. Now, to be clear, though our focus in this video is on the authenticity of anime relative to gacha games, the context that we are applying here can be extrapolated to a lesser extent to all Japanese media. In order to limit our scope, we're going to be sticking with animation and its peripheries. To start, let's examine the identity imposed upon Japan by America in greater detail. The American rebuilding effort in Japan was undertaken in 3 phases. The first phase, which occurred roughly between the years of 1945 and 1947, was punishment and government reform. The military was dismantled, war crimes trials were held, and a new constitution, written by Americans, was drafted for the Japanese nation, a constitution that remains in use to this very day. The second phase, which occurred between the years of 1947 and 1950, saw the reconstruction of the Japanese economy, away from an autocratic marriage of state and corporate power to a free market economy where capital was king. This period of economic transition was one of extreme hardship. The Japanese economy collapsed in late 1947 and famine ravaged the country. It was not until 1950, the beginning of both the Third Phase and the Korean War, that Japan's fortunes would turn. A peace treaty was formally signed between Japan and the United States, marking the end of American occupation. Sort of. It's complicated. The US, you see, had bigger fish to fry. There was a specter haunting Asia, the specter of communism, and the US desperately needed allies. The Korean War and the US crusade against the spread of communism led the United States to take a renewed interest in Japan, with an influx of American resources matching the influx of values, culture, and technologies that had come into Japan during the first two phases. And it was in this period, in the 1950s, that Japanese animation as we know it began to develop in its unique direction. There's a lot of context here concerning the origins of anime that I had to cut for brevity's sake, specifically pertaining to the origins of the shonen and shoujo categories of manga. Categories that then found their way into anime. But to make a very long story short, the growth of the printing and publishing industries in Japan during the late Meiji era saw the production of many forms of print media for all kinds of audiences, including young men and eventually young women. Many of these publications, however, collapsed during World War II for any number of myriad reasons. Economic conditions reducing consumers, rationing increasing the cost of supplies, or outright government censorship, to name a few. During Phase 1 and 2 of the post-war Japanese reconstruction, even as the rest of the Japanese economy struggled, the printing and publication industries exploded, as did thereafter the cinema, radio, and animation industries. Media ended up providing many Japanese of the time the meaning, identity, and purpose that Japan was struggling to rebuild during this era. To this day, Japanese media is built around and supported by fandoms who derive their identity from their consumption of media, and who can get very defensive about the products from which they derive said identity, as I've unfortunately discovered. But I digress. It was in this period of the early 1950s that Japanese animation emerged as distinct from its Western counterparts. Western animation, particularly in the United States, was quite a bit further along as an industry when compared to animation in Japan. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, a monumental achievement with incredibly fluid animation, memorable music, and vibrant color, premiered as early as 1937. You will recall that Princess Iron Fan, the first feature-length animated film in Asia, released in 1941. And indeed, the 1930s and 1940s saw a sort of explosion in the growth of, and quality of, animation in the United States. Looney Tunes debuted in 1930, Donald Duck joined the Mickey Mouse universe in 1934. The 30s saw the introduction of Betty Boop and Popeye the Sailor Man. In the late 30s and into the early 40s, there was Felix the Cat, Woody the Woodpecker, Casper the Friendly Ghost, and Tom and Jerry. But it wasn't all just slapstick humor, either. The year 1941 saw the release of Max Fleischer's Superman, with art and direction that is still a marvel to behold even to this very day. This period of animation history in the United States between the late 20s and the early 60s is called the Golden Age of American animation. But by the 1950s, this golden age was already slowing down, for you see, just as video killed the radio star, video also killed the golden age of animation. Producing animation for television requires meeting strict schedules and limits the amount of time and resources one can pour into any particular animation. The capital requirements of television necessitated streamlining of elements, plots were made simpler, stories and characters were dumbed down, humor became increasingly unsophisticated and slapstick, and animation quality dropped just as dramatically as a way of cutting back on production costs. Animation legend Chuck Jones, the creator of Marvin the Martian, Pepe Le Pew, and Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner, amongst other characters, gave this style of made-for-TV animation the disparaging name Illustrated Radio because it was carried more by its soundtrack than its animation or its plot. The commodification of Western animation, the co-opting of the arts for profit, had begun in earnest, and with growing profits came the apparent death of artistry in the medium. At least, that was the case in the United States. There were still some animated feature films, of course. Disney's Cinderella released in 1950 and it was a commercial hit. But by the late 50s, appetite for these larger, more meaningful animated films was in severe decline, with Sleeping Beauty, released in 1959, severely flopping at the box office. We might revisit these films in just a bit from a different perspective, but the general takeaway here is that American animation was moving increasingly in the direction of commercialization. Quality was decreasing, emotionality and authenticity were secondary to profit, and by the end of the golden age of animation, into the 60s and beyond, the selling of toys or merchandise became more important than the communication of ideas or feelings.
How toyetic can you get?
Toyetic is a word created by marketing people. It means an object or device featured in a cartoon that could easily become a mass-produced toy.
But while American animation was shrinking in scope and ambition, something very different was happening across the Pacific. As American animation turned increasingly towards commercialization, towards merchandising, simplified storytelling, towards mass production, Japanese animation was moving in a completely different direction. In the rubble of post-war Japan, where national identity and personal meaningfulness had been destroyed and rebuilt in a foreign image, it was not enough for art to merely entertain. By the end of World War II, much of the infrastructure required to produce, publish, and distribute animated films had been destroyed, as had much of Japanese industry in general. But this same destruction fueled a massive cultural appetite for escapism and meaning, which in turn created opportunities for artists. The manga and literature industries grew first, and they were followed thereafter by animation and film. The post-war era also saw American culture flood into Japan, and that included works of American animation like the aforementioned Disney films. Japanese animators and artists saw and became inspired by the vibrant and fully colored animations of Walt Disney and the highly stylized works of Max Fleischer. And it is here, at the crossroads, at the very beginning of American cultural import and Japanese soul-searching, where a crucial figure steps into the story, the so-called father of anime and god of manga, Osamu Tezuka. In my last video on the topic of anime and soft power, I made the mistake of presuming that my audience already knew about Tezuka's outsized influence on anime, and thus elected to cut out a large section on him. But I think for the purposes of this video, a discussion of Tezuka is absolutely essential. Tezuka was born in 1928, in the first few years of the Showa era, and he bore witness to all of the modernization, growing militarism, and cultural flux of that period. 1928 was also the year Steamboat Willie, Mickey Mouse's first cartoon, debuted, which incorporated synchronized music into animation for the first time. As such, just as Tezuka witnessed Japan changing before his very eyes, he also witnessed the early years of the animation industry and the achievements made during that time. When Tezuka was a boy, his father took him to see Disney movies, and he developed a deep love for Disney. For example, Tezuka claims to have seen Bambi over 80 times. Disney, ostensibly, is where Tezuka borrowed the now iconic large anime eyes, not merely for aesthetics alone, but because Tezuka believed that the eyes were the window to the soul, that the larger eyes could be used to create deeper empathy with his audience. Now, despite Tezuka's love for Disney, it was not Disney films that most inspired Tezuka's passion for animation. As per Daisy Yu's an animated wartime encounter was none other than Princess Iron Fan, the feature-length Chinese animated film that most inspired Tezuka's decision to become an animator. From Princess Iron Fan, Tezuka took away that unique style of Chinese storytelling that the Wan brothers put into their work, using Chinese and cultural context as a backdrop, to tell a story with a lesson. But he also took away the fact that animation needn't be funny or childish. Animation could carry the weight of an epic narrative, and animation needn't be exclusively Western. There was indeed a way to create animation within the East Asian cultural context. During the war, when Tezuka was still a teenager, he was drafted to work in a factory to support the war effort. He saw the cold ruthlessness of war and how it stripped the dreams away from people at home, even as it took the lives of innocents abroad. He watched Japanese wartime animated propaganda like the Momotaro films and found inspiration there as well. He saw in them the power to convey a message of propaganda, and he thought he could also use that same power to convey other messages of responsibility, caring, and compassion. Then after the war, Tezuka did something that'll sound very familiar to many a good Asian amongst us. He got accepted into Osaka University and began studying medicine. Yet in his heart, he was first and foremost an artist. At the age of 17, in the year 1945, Tezuka published his first professional work, Diary of Ma-chan, where already his distinctive style and empathetic writing could be seen. While in medical school, Tezuka published several other manga series, including a few different minor works in 1947, Lost World in 1948, Metropolis in 1949, and Next World in 1951, each of which were science fiction novels with fantastical worlds. These kinds of works weren't just exercises in world building, though. They were early experiments in the kinds of questions that would define Tezuka's entire career. What is the cost of progress? Can humanity live in harmony with technology? And what does it mean to be human? Thereafter, Tezuka published his first major hit, a manga you might be familiar with called Kimba the White Lion, known in Japan as Janguru Taite. Kimba was, on its surface, a children's story about a lion cub destined to rule the jungle. But just beneath that surface, just a little deeper, there were themes of environmentalism, inherited trauma, the moral responsibilities of leadership, and the challenge of building peace in a world that is shaped by violence. They were all issues that echoed Japan's post-war anxieties and contributed to the national discourse around Japan's identity, moral responsibility, and future. Kimba, though iconic, would not prove to be Tezuka's most enduring work. In 1951, Tezuka published the manga Ambassador Adam, and though Ambassador Adam was only a modest success, the series introduced a character who would soon become a cornerstone of anime history. A humanoid robot boy named Adam, whom Tezuka would spin off into his own story, Tetsuwan Atomu, known in the West as Astro Boy. And what made Astro Boy so enduring, so monumental, was not just its futuristic setting or action-packed sequences, but the powerful emotional core at its center. Astro Boy was a story about the definition of life, a story about father-son estrangement, about discrimination, and about the search for humanity in an increasingly mechanized world. In just the intro, Astro Boy beats up the Klan and fights the bankers, who are wearing a suspiciously similar outfit to the Klan. I'm joking, of course, but only sort of. None of these were incidental themes. They reflected the anxieties of post-war Japan, much in the same way that Superman once embodied the idealism and fears of America during its own post-war soul-searching.
You've got to agree to stop your attacks on us and your newspaper with your dirty lies. Stop standing up for those yellow foreigners.
They're not foreigners. They're darn good Americans. A whole lot better than you are.
Quiet, you young punk.
The Lees are American citizens, entitled to the same privileges as any of us.
They're not Americans. They're foreigners. Their skin isn't white.
So what? The Indians who were here before us are red-skinned. Does that make them foreigners?
I'm not talking about the Indians.
You're talking rot, and you know it. The nation was founded by foreigners and built by foreigners. Everyone here either came from another country or is descended from folks who did. Don't you ever read your history, you stupid bigot?
That's telling him, Chief.
Now look here, you two. I warn you.
It's a shame that we're still relearning lessons from the 40s here in the United States, but that's a different video for a different day. But back to Tezuka, he was not content with merely telling stories on paper. He believed in the power of moving pictures and wanted to reach a broader audience. He wanted to create animation that was not merely a spectacle, but a vessel for empathy and reflection. And so, in the early 1960s, Tezuka took a major risk and founded Mushi Production, an animation studio that forever altered the course of Japanese animation. For you see, around the same time that American studios like Hanna-Barbera were shifting from cinematic animation to television, producing cost-efficient shows like The Flintstones, the Japanese animation industry was facing a similar constraint, the need to produce weekly TV episodes on a shoestring budget. To that end, Tezuka turned to a technique called limited animation, but unlike his American counterparts who used it mainly to churn out cheap cartoons, Tezuka reimagined limited animation as a tool for storytelling. He essentially industrialized the process by breaking down animation into discrete production roles and codifying shortcuts like holding on still frames while animating only the mouth and eyes. Rather than treating limited animation as a clumsy workaround, Tezuka transformed it into a complete production philosophy, a philosophy that prioritized storytelling and emotional resonance over expensive, fluid motion or crude humor. In so doing, Tezuka established the iconic visual language of anime that is still prevalent to this very day. What began as a necessity born of budgetary limits became a creative strength. Constraints, after all, often fuel innovation, and it was the constraints of television production that pushed Tezuka, Mushi Productions, and the entire generation that followed to rely on other tools to tell their stories, to lean into a unique emotional grammar, which they used to craft stories that were culturally resonant and distinctly Japanese. Tezuka didn't exist in a vacuum. The animation and publishing industries were already on the rise independent of Tezuka, and Japanese cinema was entering its own creative golden age. Yet even amidst this flourishing cultural landscape, Tezuka's contributions to anime were foundational, not just in form or technique, but in feeling, in vibes. The emotional vocabulary that Tezuka and early anime pioneers introduced made it possible to tell stories rich with vulnerability and introspection. And yet, even as anime and manga opened new doors for emotional exploration, they inherited the contradictions of the society that birthed them. Or to be fair, the contradictions forced upon the society that birthed them. Tezuka was a pioneer and an artist, but he was also a businessman. Astro Boy was not only a revolutionary leap forward for anime as an art form, it was also a revolutionary leap forward for anime as a business. The so-called first anime boom, which started with Astro Boy in the 1960s, introduced the Astro Boy business model, where a show might be made and broadcast at a financial loss while profiting off of sponsorship and licensing deals. A sponsor's products might even directly appear in the anime itself, an early form of product placement. And while this still happens today in anime, it became less and less important for the anime industry, as we'll soon see. This business model of subsidizing production through external sponsorship remained dominant into the late 70s during what is called the second anime boom. It was during the second anime boom that we saw shows like Space Battleship Yamato and Mobile Suit Gundam. Anime was no longer just promoting other companies' products, anime itself became the product. Instead of embedding advertisements for chocolate bars or soft drinks, shows like Gundam and Yamato partnered with toy companies to sell model kits, action figures, posters, and soundtracks. In other words, instead of being paid to advertise someone else's goods with your show becomes an engine to sell your own merchandise. But the path that anime took to merchandising and commercialization was quite different and arguably more effective than the path that Western animation took. You might already be able to see where this is going. If you profit more from selling toys, posters, and body pillows than from the show itself, then it is in your interest to cultivate the kind of audience that will buy these things. You lean into what makes your product appealing to begin with. It is in your interest to deepen emotional attachment, to create characters that are not just memorable, but desirable, collectible, and ownable. Is an honorific that vaguely translates into a second-person you, and it was first used to categorize hardcore anime fans in 1983 by Akio Nakamori, who coined the term in his, and I quote, lolicon hentai manga magazine, called Manga Buriko. For those of us who may require otaku translation into plain language, it was a magazine that fetishized children and portrayed them in obscene ways. From the very outset then, the defining characteristic of the otaku is unhealthy obsession. Wikipedia defines an otaku as a term that describes people with consuming interests. An otaku necessarily builds his or her personality around a product being sold to them. And the anime industry, in cultivating that fan base, began to shape its own products rather cynically around new emotional and sexual templates, around characters designed to be adored, to be desired, and to be owned. By the early 90s, this shift was impossible to ignore. Anime increasingly centered not only around grand adventures or moral dilemmas, but around characters carefully calibrated for emotional and sometimes parasocial, or even to coin a term here, fomantic attachment. Consider, for example, the blushing dere-dere schoolgirl, or the aggressive but secretly doting tsundere. These aren't just characters, these are emotional templates, carefully tuned to spark longing, protectiveness, and even excitement, designed to be fantasized about and ultimately merchandised. Shows like Sailor Moon, of which I'm a self-professed fan of, by the way, may have empowered a generation of young girls, but they also became vehicles for selling dolls, costumes, posters, and more. It's seldom even the fault of the artist, but it is a feature of the industry. Meanwhile, titles aimed at male audiences increasingly blurred the lines between affection and desire, between emotional connection and ownership. In 1998, there was Love Hina, a romantic comedy anime where a hapless young man finds himself living in a dorm full of beautiful girls, each with a distinct, tropey personality, with each of their potential affections slowly unfolding into a pseudo-harem. Access to the girls' vulnerabilities and traumas are framed as rewards for the protagonist's persistence, almost like a video game. In this way, affection becomes collectible and care becomes conquest. The emotional grammar of anime, the tenderness, the introspection, the longing, gradually became retooled from a medium of exploration into the machinery of exploitation and extraction. This emotionality, this vulnerability even, didn't just become a commodity by accident. This commodification occurred alongside and was affected by the rise and retreat of feminism in post-war Japan and the cultural compromises that followed. So let us take a step back then and see how anime and manga rose and evolved alongside feminism in Japan, and how the outcome of Japanese feminism impacted the continuing development of anime and gacha games. Because in the end, it is easier to package longing than to confront its causes. It is safer to sell the illusion of care than to truly offer it, and nowhere is this emotional commodification more entangled than in anime's portrayal of women. Commodified, bought, and sold. To understand how anime came to reflect and at times distort the image of women, we need to take a step outside of the medium for a moment and look into the broader story of feminism. Now, I know the word feminism can feel loaded, but stick with me here. Let's approach this matter academically and not ideologically. At its core, feminism is the belief in the social, economic, and political equality of the sexes. But like any ideology, it didn't emerge fully formed. It evolved, shaped by history, culture, and the needs and perspectives of those advocating for change. In the West, the first wave of feminism emerged in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and it focused primarily on legal rights such as suffrage or the right to vote, property ownership, and access to education, amongst other rights. Although there were some stirrings of feminist thought during the Taisho era, the rise of the militarist government throughout the early 20th century saw these movements heavily suppressed. And by World War II, feminist activism had been all but crushed, and certain noted feminists even turned their pens towards supporting the war effort. The second wave of feminism began in the West in the 1960s, and it took on a much broader range of issues, including workplace discrimination, reproductive rights, sexual freedom, and the critique of traditional gender roles. The focus of feminism moved from equality under the law to equality of lived experience, and it is here that we see the concept of patriarchal society enter into the discourse, how a male-dominated society shapes everything from the home to the workplace to the media. And even though Japan didn't experience a first wave, the second wave of feminism entered Japanese discourse through cultural interaction with the United States. The late 1960s and the 70s in Japan marked a period of renewed introspection and social change. The country was enjoying very rapid economic growth, and a new generation of Japanese women began to question their roles in a society that still expected them to be good wives and wise mothers, ryosai kenbo, an idealized role for Japanese women that emphasized obedience and domesticity. Despite modernization in nearly every other domain, gender equality in post-war Japan had been largely codified from the outside in. It was the United States, after all, and not the Japanese activists that enshrined women's rights in the post-war constitution. But as feminist texts from the US circulated in translation, and as Japanese women reflected on their own lived experiences, a homegrown feminist movement began to take shape, one that sought to challenge not just legal inequality, but the very cultural norms that sustained it. The second wave of feminism manifested as the Uman Ribu movement, literally meaning women's lib, a radical feminist push in 1970s Japan that confronted everything from domestic violence to cultural conformity, and that challenged not only traditional gender roles but also the hierarchy and conformity of post-war Japanese society as a whole. The Ribu movement brought previously taboo subjects like domestic violence and reproductive autonomy and turned them into political issues for the first time in Japanese history. And these issues of the body and the soul, of emotion, of conflict and vulnerability, interacted with anime's growing emotional and symbolic language. As anime grew in sophistication throughout the 70s and 80s, these feminist undercurrents didn't just vanish, they filtered into the stories being told, often in contradictory ways. Consider, for example, the transformation that occurred in the manga and anime genre of shoujo. Shoujo means young girl, and it refers to the genre's target audience. As westernization came to Japan during the Meiji era, and with it educated women, a new class of literate girls emerged, and with them came a new market for print media. In the 1910s and 20s, magazines for girls began to define what girlhood could look like. These magazines included stories, poetry, essays, and illustrations that emphasized innocence, moral virtue, and sentimentality. These early portrayals, you see, were idealizations created largely by men, who crafted this fantasy of innocence and sold it to young women. However, when manga exploded in the post-war period, shoujo manga followed suit. The early shoujo manga of the 1950s and early 60s was still largely produced by men and tended to feature fairy tale settings, clean arcs, and innocent, girlish romance. But even in this era, we can already see the seeds of something greater. Consider once again Osamu Tezuka and his 1953 work Riben no Kishi, or Princess Knight. Princess Knight tells the story of Princess Sapphire, a girl who must disguise herself as a prince in order to inherit the throne of Silverland, where women are forbidden from ruling. Tezuka's work was truly groundbreaking back then. Sapphire was a gender-fluid heroine, raised as both a prince and a princess, and the manga tackled themes of gender roles and ambiguity long before they entered the mainstream discourse. The real transformation in shoujo, though, came during the late 1960s and early 70s, just as the second wave of feminism was sweeping through Japan. For the first time, young women were entering the manga industry not just as consumers, but as creators. There was even a name for this cohort, the Year 24 group, referencing in this case the 24th year of Showa, 1949, the birth year of many of its key members. The Year 24 group included such artists as Moto Hagio, who popularized Bishonen and who legitimized shonen-ai, a romantic genre for young women where two young men fall in love. Keiko Takemiya, whose manga Kaze Toki no Uta dared to depict male-on-male sexuality in open terms. Yumiko Oshima, who pioneered a poetic, minimalistic style of storytelling centered on the fragile inner worlds of girls. And Ryoko Ikeda, who brought sweeping historical drama and revolutionary politics into what was once a shallow pond of tropey plot devices and settings. Together, these artists and other women like them redefined what shoujo could say, and thereby who shoujo was for. But even as these women transformed manga, and even as feminist thought entered the national discourse, the wave eventually crested. In the West, second-wave feminism was slowly transforming into the beginnings of third-wave feminism. The second wave, you see, was beginning to buckle under the weight of internal critiques, specifically surrounding race, class, and sexuality. Mainstream feminism centered around the voices and concerns of white, middle-class women to the exclusion of all others. To this day, radical feminists who cling to the second wave might still concern themselves primarily with the needs of middle to upper class white women at the exclusion and cost of everyone else. But I digress. These internet critiques of the rigidity and essentialism of the second wave, this backlash against the idea that there was this universal definition of what a woman was and could be, sparked the third wave, which emphasized individual identity, diversity, and intersectionality. Intersectionality is kind of what we're doing right now. It's a framework for understanding how multiple forms of inequality or discrimination, such as racism, sexism, or classism, overlap and interact in real life. To give you an example of intersectionality, in Kimberly Crenshaw's seminal work, Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, Crenshaw focuses on black women in particular, and how they were often excluded from both the anti-racist and feminist frameworks. Second-wave feminism was centered on white women and overlooked racial differences, and the anti-racism movement was often centered on black men and ignored gender, which in turn meant that the experiences of black women fell through the cracks of both movements. Intersectionality then seeks to mend that void. But I digress. It was during third-wave feminism in the West that the conversation expanded to include queerness, race, intersectionality, and the commodification of identity. Yet in Japan, things did not quite evolve in the same way. Instead of continuing towards a broader societal shift, Japan's feminist movement stalled. The Ribu movement fragmented, and many of its ideals were absorbed, softened, or sidelined in favor of comfortable consumerism and conformity. Feminism, now more associated with individual self-expression than collective political change, slowly became more niche, to the point where it became viewed with skepticism if not outright hostility, as confrontational or even foreign. And there is nowhere where this tension is more clearly visible than in anime and manga, because even as the emotional vocabulary of shoujo continued to expand, even as anime opened new windows into the inner lives of women, those same windows often became mirrors for something else. For sexualization, commodification, and the fantasy of the feminine self as a product. The very commodification that the Western Third Wave critiqued, but in its own ways, would eventually succumb to. As second-wave feminism in Japan faded from a radical movement into a more individualistic form of self-expression, the revolutionary demands of the Uman Ribu movement were gradually diluted. feminism, once concerned with structural transformation and collective liberation, went from being political to aestheticized. It became reduced to gestures, symbols, and personal style. Being a strong woman became a matter of personal appearance and attitude instead of a matter of systemic change. Consider the gyaru, a nonconformist fashion subculture that emerged in the 1990s. In open defiance of the traditional ideas of the Ryosai Kenbo, the good wife and wise mother, instead of being a housewife or fitting the prevailing beauty standards of pale skin, dark hair, youthful innocence, and modest dress, gyarus embraced loud fashion, bleached hair, heavy makeup, deep tans, and nightlife culture. They challenged dominant gender norms not through protest, but through presence. This in and of itself is not a bad thing. It is, in its own way, quite admirable. But this sort of aesthetic feminism, reliant on consumption, was easy to commodify. It could be easily repackaged by fashion companies, recycled as idol culture or pop media, and turned into a consumable aesthetic stripped of its political edge and message. In a society where open political confrontation is often met with discomfort and dismissal, aesthetic resistance becomes a safer form of rebellion. But the problem with aesthetic resistance is that it is easily co-opted and turned against itself. Gyaru culture, for all its power as a symbolic rejection of Japanese femininity, was ultimately subsumed into the very system it opposed. Magazines like Pop Teen commercialized the look and sanded off its edges, while the idol industry began producing gyaru-coded performers, packaging defiance as cuteness and independence as conformity. What began as a grassroots cultural movement became a feedback loop of consumption. And just as this happened with the gyaru, so too did mainstream Japanese media in general absorb the language of liberation without its content. Empowerment became visual rather than structural. A heroine might be headstrong or independent or even a gyaru, but rarely did she challenge the framework around her. Anime too reflected this shift. Female characters could be powerful and independent, but they were often filtered through a gaze that emphasized marketable vulnerability, aesthetic quirk, or erotic appeal. Now, of course, I'm not referring to all anime or manga here, and there were artists who attempted to subvert these problems within the industry and wider Japanese society. Even then, their subversion could be subverted or merchandised, and their message was often lost upon their audiences as a result. None of this is unique to Japan, of course, but in Japan, where feminism was never institutionally entrenched, and where the memory of Umanribu was quietly shelved rather than publicly debated, the slide from politics to posturing was, is, and remains particularly stark. The woman who speaks openly about systemic sexism in Japan might not be seen as brave, but as confrontational, out of sync. Too American, too Western. Even within anime fandoms, the very term feminist has become something of a shorthand for overreach or censorship or ruining the fun. And such fun ruining is often blamed on foreign interference in Japanese matters. But why foreign interference? Did feminism develop differently in the West? Let's take a brief detour and see how third-wave feminism developed in the West, and compare that with feminism in Japan. As second-wave feminism crested in the West during the 1980s and 90s, it began to fragment under the weight of its contradictions. Second-wave feminism had achieved an enormous amount, from workplace protections to reproductive rights, but its foundations were no longer adequate for the work that remained. Marginalized voices, particularly those of women of color, queer women, and working-class women, found themselves excluded from the dominant feminist narrative. It was from this critique, you will recall, that third-wave feminism emerged, not as a single unified movement, but as a constellation, if you will, of efforts to challenge the essentialism, the very rigid definitions of the second wave. And third-wave feminists aimed to understand how race, gender, sexuality, and class intersected to shape one's lived experiences. But even as the third wave broadened the scope of feminism's concerns, it also opened the door to a new contradiction: the commercialization of feminism itself. In the late 90s and into the early 2000s, as feminism moved further into the mainstream consciousness, as it became normalized and no longer revolutionary, its rhetoric began to show up in places far removed from protest marches, seminal thesis papers, or political manifestos. Feminist language like girl power, boss babe, and girl boss started to appear everywhere, from shampoo bottles to Super Bowl ads to little wooden sign things that one might arbitrarily hang in one's kitchen above one's equally arbitrary bowl of decorative lemons. And this wasn't an accident. Feminist activists in the late 20th century had, in many ways, succeeded in the core goal of pushing once radical ideas into the public sphere. The second wave laid the legal groundwork, but the third wave understood that legal change is not enough. To truly reshape society, feminism had to permeate culture. Third-wave feminists sought to reclaim femininity from patriarchal caricature, to assert that you could be strong and soft, assertive and stylish. Feminism became about inclusion and fluidity, about individual experience over collective ideology. There was no longer a single definition of womanhood, so banished was the essentialism of the second wave. And this individualism, in theory, was liberating, but in practice was exploitable. The emphasis on choice and individual identity over unified revolution made feminism easier to pick apart, and the aesthetics of feminism easier to commodify and market. The third wave said women could wear heels and lipstick and be girly as they like and still be feminists. Capitalism replied, "Excellent, well I've got 100 shades of women's empowerment lipstick to sell you with your name on it." Media figures, including pop stars, actors, and influencers, began to invoke feminism as a personal brand. Companies marketed everything from razor blades to fast fashion with the imagery of feminist empowerment. The machine of capitalism had found a way to repackage liberation as a product. Empowerment was no longer about dismantling systems, it was about feeling confident, looking good, and buying the right things. The third wave opened the door to a wider public acceptance of feminism, but it also opened the door to its commodification. When feminism became about choice without critique of the conditions in which those choices were made, when identity became a marketplace, identity itself became vulnerable to branding. Empowerment in that framework is not a collective project but a feeling, a vibe. And feelings, it turns out, can be bought and sold. That is not to say that the third wave was a failure. The third wave made crucial and unprecedented space for intersectionality, for LGBTQ inclusion, for a redefinition and new understanding of what womanhood even is. And it left behind a new toolkit, a new vocabulary, a richer language of identity, and an understanding that personal experience also matters. But personal experience is not all that matters. And it was in this space that the fourth wave of feminism emerged. The fourth wave inherits the third wave's emphasis on identity, but it ties that identity back into a systemic critique. Where the third wave says you can wear heels and still be a feminist, the fourth wave asks who made those heels, under what conditions, and who profits. The fourth wave, often dated to the early 2010s, emerged not in classrooms or protest marches alone, but primarily in the digital commons, in hashtags, live streams, and viral videos. Like this one. Hopefully. It calls out abusers on social media. It demands not only aesthetics and representation, but responsibility and accountability from celebrities, corporations, and institutions alike. It challenges media narratives, interrogates power, and reclaims anger as a force for change. In many ways, the fourth wave is a direct response to the depoliticization of feminism in the third wave. But the fourth wave, as we're seeing in real time, is not immune to the tides it swims in. It exists in an online ecosystem driven by algorithms, virality, and profit motive. And thus, even as the fourth wave challenges commodification, it is constantly being reabsorbed by the market. Dishonest influencers turn political anger into personal branding. Corporate social media accounts adopt the aesthetics of resistance to sell you products. Identity becomes a curated aesthetic. Your very identity might be built upon a product that someone else is selling to you. Your fandom, your stan, your go-to game, your favorite pop idol or Instagram influencer or Twitch streamer, or even your favorite terribly handsome lawyer/moon-themed YouTuber. Feminism, in this environment, must constantly fight not only its external opponents, but its own co-optation. It can be difficult in a never-ending algorithmic feed to tell the difference between solidarity and marketing. And if this is what the struggle of feminism looks like in the West, where fourth-wave feminism has at least gained some cultural traction, what happens in Japan, where even the third wave never fully manifested, and where feminism was aestheticized before it could even become politicized? In Japan, the third wave never quite took hold in the same way that it did in the West. There were certainly feminists who carried forward the ideals of intersectionality and individual identity, but these movements remained largely marginalized and academic. Consider the work of the Japanese feminist scholar Tezuka Ueno, whose work The Study of the Sexy Girl was partially a critique of the Umanribu movement, and which was a big inspiration for this video. She wrote in that work as early as 1982 that sexism in the modern family does not owe its roots to pre-modern traditions, but rather is a merciless product of the post-industrial economic structure. Although her critiques were pioneering and intersectional for their time, they remained primarily within academic and activist circles, with limited mass adoption. The commodification of feminism in Japan didn't follow political liberation into mainstream public discourse as it did in the West. Instead, it preempted it. In other words, hold my hand. Sorry, I couldn't resist. In other words, feminism in Japan wasn't crushed by capitalism. It was absorbed before it even had a fighting chance. It arrived at the destination of third-wave feminism without traveling through the stops along the way. Going back to anime for a moment, the emotional rawness of anime is what allows the medium to shine. It creates space for characters to feel, to cry, to doubt, to grieve, and to long, sure, but also to celebrate, to reminisce, and to love. These weren't just narrative tropes. This emotionality was a moment of cultural expression born from a society navigating loss, recovery, and a violent reorientation of identity in the wake of war and modernization. But it is precisely because there was not a more widespread feminist movement to hammer those feelings into the political zeitgeist that the emotional vocabulary of anime and manga drifted from introspection into indulgence. Not everyone welcomed this shift, of course, and often it was the anime and manga artists themselves who raged against the industrial machine exploiting both them as creators and you as consumers. Hayao Miyazaki of Ghibli fame amongst others, warned that the very soul of Japanese animation, its emotional honesty and complexity, was being eroded by industrialization and commercialization. In interviews, Miyazaki bitterly criticizes the rise of anime made by otaku for otaku, arguing that it traded emotional depth for self-indulgence, that it no longer sought to tell human stories, but to flatter its audience's desires. His grief wasn't just for the industry, it was for the hollowing out of this unique emotional vocabulary, for the inauthenticity that had permeated the medium. Miyazaki states, and I quote, "Almost all Japanese animation is produced with hardly any basis taken from observing real people, you know. It's produced by humans who can't stand looking at other humans, and that's why the industry is full of otaku." End quote. But the tides were already turning. Anime's emotional power, born of real vulnerability, was too potent not to be commodified. And soon, what once had been a tool for empathy became something else entirely. Consider, for example, the rise of moe and the evolution of kawaii culture, both concepts rooted in emotional openness, but each transformed into powerful engines of commercial appeal. Moe refers to a deep instinctive feeling of affection or protectiveness towards fictional characters. Generally, this means a young, emotionally fragile or socially awkward girl. This term moe was originally an organic fan term, but it quickly grew into a genre of its own and then, eventually, a formula. Studios began to design characters not to express ideas or challenge assumptions, but to elicit a predictable emotional response. By making characters helpless, soft, melancholy, and innocent, audiences were encouraged to feel needed, protective, or even attached. Characters weren't written with complex inner lives. They became constructed like emotional puzzles, optimized to evoke longing, desire, or sympathy. Averted gazes, stammered speech, tragic backstories, apologetic gestures, these all became viral shorthand for commodified vulnerability. Kawaii culture followed a similar path. Originally, kawaii simply meant cute, charming, childlike, innocent. But in post-war Japan, especially from the 1970s and onwards, kawaii evolved into something more, not a mere adjective to describe cuteness but a lifestyle, and ultimately, a marketing tool. Kawaii at first was something of a countercultural movement, a rebellion. Young women rejected the harshness of the adult world by embracing exaggerated softness in return. But over time, this rebellion was aestheticized, absorbed by the market, and sold back to people as identities. idol agencies, fashion brands, animation studios, VTuber studios, and corporations like Sanrio discovered that cuteness wasn't just appealing, it was very profitable. Cuteness begets affection. It softens interactions. It makes people easier to like and things easier to sell. This emotional work of managing appearances, soothing emotions, and making others feel good is part of what sociologist Arlie Hochschild famously called, in her 1983 book, The Managed Heart, emotional labor. Emotional labor refers to the work of managing one's own emotions or the emotions of others as part of a paid job. Think of the service worker who must smile and empathize and absorb frustrations, not because they want to, but because their paycheck demands it. Their emotional performance is part of the labor. It becomes part of the product. Cuteness becomes a form of emotional labor performed in speech, posture, and appearance. A way to signal approachability, docility, availability, and non-threatening femininity, whether you're a pop idol, a maid cafe waitress, a cosplayer, or just a cashier at Family Mart. Like moe, kawaii becomes a system of signifiers. Big eyes, high voices, oversized sweaters, bows, apologies, and clumsy gestures. These aren't just traits, they are carefully crafted and marketed cues, designed to disarm and to make characters, products, and women more desirable through manufactured infantilization. And because this aesthetic has proven so commercially successful, it saturates not just anime, but pop culture. Again, not because it reflects the lived experiences of women, but because as a commodity, it sells so well. Kawaii has become a form of emotional expression stripped of critique, a performance of choice and identity detached from the politics that might cause one to ask the fundamental questions of the fourth wave. Why did kawaii come about? What does it say about femininity? Who gets to define femininity? And who profits from it? And as the line between sincere expression and exploitative indulgence grows increasingly thin, we arrive at what might be called the otaku fantasy, a cultural and commercial feedback loop where vulnerability, cuteness, and emotional labor are not merely aesthetic choices but interactive fantasies designed for consumption. In this fantasy, a character is not merely observed, not merely understood, they are owned like emotional property. Going back once more to Hayao Miyazaki, Miyazaki once stated, "Many of my movies have strong female leads, brave, self-sufficient girls that don't think twice about fighting for what they believe with all their heart. They'll need a friend or a supporter, but never a savior. Any woman is just as capable of being a hero as any man." But this authenticity has no place in the commodified otaku fantasy. Miyazaki continues in this 1988 interview with Animeju magazine, and I quote, "It's difficult. My female protagonists immediately become the subjects of Rorikon Goko, play toys for Lolita complex males. In a sense, if we want to depict someone who is affirmative to us, we have no choice but to make them as lovely as possible. But now, there are too many people who shamelessly depict such protagonists as if they just want such girls as pets, and things are escalating more and more." Miyazaki saw this problem from a mile away as well. This interview, remember, was from 1988. Consider how far things have come since then. In the otaku fantasy, the moe girl isn't compelling because she grows and challenges the viewer as Miyazaki's protagonists might. She's compelling because she is a safe space that demands nothing from the otaku. Her affection is guaranteed and her agency is optional. This antisocial behavior then leaks out of the fiction and into reality. In my video, Gacha Games in the South Korean Gender War, we discussed briefly how misogynists, mainly in this case perpetually online young men in South Korea, will call their own Korean women kimchi-nyo, kimchi women, implying they're rotten like kimchi, that they're superficial, gold-digging, and of poor quality. These same misogynists contrast these rotten kimchi women with sushi-nyo, sushi women, implying freshness, obedience, and depth, referring in this case to the perception of what an idealized Japanese woman might be. Where do these men get their idealized perception of Japanese women from? I'll give you a hint, it's not from heavily censored Korean media which would prefer to paint Koreans in a better light. Why do these men have such a distorted view of reality? Well, it's because they are constantly engaging with a fantasy that coddles their egos in exchange for their affection and their money. It's like the allegory of the cave, right? These perpetually online internet men, not just in Korea but in Japan, in China, and here in the West as well, are chained prisoners looking at shadows on the wall. They're trapped in a cycle of commercial exploitation that keeps them locked away from genuine intimacy, while it feeds them a distorted reality designed to ensnare them as consumers. And over time, that distorted reality becomes the only one that they know and the only one that they can relate with. The otaku fantasy is the illusion of intimacy without the discomfort of reciprocity. It is a fantasy of emotional fulfillment, tailor-made and sold to the consumer, where softness is obedience, trauma is exciting, and care is a reward to be purchased. It is a parasocial relationship, finely tuned to monetize longing. And there is one industry where all of these elements come together: the commodification of anime, the exploitation of emotional labor, and the otaku fantasy, but ratcheted up to the maximum degree. And that industry, dear viewers, is gacha games. The term gacha comes from the sound of a capsule toy machine. You turn the crank, and ga-chunk, out pops a surprise toy in a plastic orb. You don't know what you'll get. It could be a common trinket you already own, or it could be a shiny, rare prize. That randomness, the thrill of uncertainty, is part of the charm and the hook. But gacha machines, even from the outset, were never just about toys. They were a carefully engineered loop of scarcity. Gacha prizes became introduced as sets. As such, you didn't just want a single toy, you wanted the whole set. You wanted to try again, just one more spin. It's a slot machine, masquerading as a toy machine. When mobile games took off in Japan in the early 2000s, it didn't take long for gacha to go digital. The model of consumption was already baked into the Japanese experience. Early mobile titles like Dragon Collection, released in 2010 on the social networking platform Gree, were some of the first games to utilize randomized pull mechanics. You paid to summon new items, monsters, or characters, which you could then use for gameplay. These early gacha games were about collecting and competing, not bonding. You weren't nurturing a character or experiencing their story, you were grinding for stats. But that began to change in 2011 when games like Rage of Bahamut released. I remember, I was there, I was pretty into Shingeki no Bahamuto. Here was a gacha game that didn't just give you cards, it gave you collectible characters with beautiful anime art and hints of story. And from there the industry evolved rather quickly. Games like Fate Grand Order and Grand Blue Fantasy, which utilized anime aesthetics, didn't just offer units, they offered relationships. You didn't just pull for stats, you pulled for affection, for backstory, for the emotional promise that this character would interact with you, trust you, rely on you, and belong to you. You weren't just investing with your wallet, you were investing with your heart. By the late 2010s, anime-style gacha had become the dominant model for gacha games. Honkai Impact, Arknights, Epic 7, and the incredibly weirdly named Pokémon Masters X. I mean, there were just so many gacha games, many of which are still around and doing quite well for themselves. And that was just the beginning. The mobile gacha market has only expanded even further. Today, MiHoYo, a privately owned company, has a valuation of $23 billion. That is billion with the B. Do you understand how insane that is? Let me give you some perspective. Valve, the creators of Steam, who have a near monopoly on the PC gaming market, is also a privately owned company. As of March 2024, Valve has a valuation of around $7 billion. MiHoYo's valuation is more than 3 times larger than Valve. MiHoYo's valuation is larger than the market cap of the Fox Corporation, Warner Brothers, and Bandai Namco. Gacha games are exceedingly profitable because they are elegantly designed machines of extraction. They don't just gamify scarcity, they gamify longing. Virtually every top-grossing gacha game today isn't just a game in that respect. It's basically an anime, from which gacha games borrow the sheer commercial power of the otaku fantasy. Blue Archive, Nikkei, Honkai Star Rail, Genshin Impact, Wuthering Waves, Uma Musume Purity Derby, Zenless Zone Zero, Arknights, Girls Frontline, Love in Deep Space. These titles don't merely sell weapons and skins and clothes, they sell affection. They sell characters whose every blush, every word, every tragic backstory, and every unlockable outfit has been designed for emotional effect. A commodified waifu or husbando, polished, packaged, and sold to you. And these games don't just use anime aesthetics as mere decoration, they use anime's emotional grammar as infrastructure. The fantasy isn't just to fight alongside your favorite character, it's to be needed by them. Valued by them, to be their protector, their confidant, their sensei or captain or doctor or commander, to be the trailblazer, the traveler, the rover, the guardian, the hero, the lover. They're indispensable. only you. And in the context of that fantasy, every pull of the lever isn't just a gamble for strength, it's a chance at intimacy. The result of which isn't just a game, it's a parasocial slot machine, a system that rewards your emotional investment by selling it back to you, one limited banner at a time. There is another foible to it all, however. This commercialization of emotions isn't just selling you affection for your waifus or husbandos. It is also indirectly selling you affection for Japan itself. Remember the kimchi-nyo and the sushi-nyo. Consider all the weebs all over the world who have idealized Japan into this mythical place. You've seen the phenomenon yourself, I'm sure. Place, Japan. These photos may look similar, but one is magical and the other is Brazil. Because even as anime and by proxy gacha games refined the art of emotional monetization, they also carried with them the cultural DNA of their origin. The voice acting, the story beats, the aesthetic codes of anime and manga that had over decades come to define Japan's identity on the world stage. The player wasn't just collecting characters, they were also collecting pieces of Japan. A stylized, emotionalized fantasy of Japan, made addictive. The gacha revolution wasn't just a commercial breakthrough, it was proof that emotional investment could be monetized even beyond what anime had already achieved. Yet even as Japanese developers were perfecting this machinery of desire, others were quietly and carefully watching. Because to the biggest players on the global stage, the true power of anime, of gacha games, of the otaku fantasy itself is not the financial power that these things wield, it's the cultural power, the soft power. Do these players owning your wallet is valuable? Sure. But owning your dreams, that is invaluable. After World War II, Japan needed not only to rebuild its economy, it needed to rebuild its global image. Other countries won't want to trade with you if they see you as an invader or as a producer of cheap junk. Japan needed soft power. The term soft power, coined by political scientist Joseph Nye, describes a nation's ability to shape the preferences of others through attraction rather than coercion. For Japan, a country constitutionally barred from military action and still haunted by its wartime legacy, soft power wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity. And Japan's ruling party, the Liberal Democratic Party, the LDP, realized this almost immediately. In the 1950s and 60s, the Japanese government undertook a massive project of national reconstruction, which sought not only to rebuild the Japanese economy, but to deliberately rebrand Japan's global image. Through so-called guided capitalism, an economic model where the state actively selects and supports key sectors rather than leaving them entirely to market forces, the government handpicked certain industries like electronics, automobiles, and heavy machinery, and cultivated them through subsidies, low-interest loans, export incentives, and protectionist tariffs. And alongside these economic efforts, diplomatic efforts abroad worked in tandem to create an image of New Japan. Take a look at Japan's pavilion at the 1958 World's Fair in Brussels. What's on display here? At the top, there's the ruins of Hiroshima. We're not the invaders, we're the victims. In the center, a Buddha, emphasizing Japan's peaceful spiritual Zen traditions. To the right, there's a Japanese-made dump truck to showcase Japan's modern industry and economic revival, and in the background, infrastructure being built, a vision of New Japan. At the same time, cultural diplomacy initiatives, Bunka Gaiko, were launched through organizations like the Japan Foundation. Traditional arts, once considered old-fashioned or even barbaric, like calligraphy, tea ceremonies, and kabuki, were exported to the West to soften Japan's image. NHK World, the Japanese state broadcaster, began reaching out to international audiences. Sponsored film festivals abroad screened hand-picked Japanese movies. Japanese TV dramas were licensed, sometimes even at a financial loss, just to build international goodwill. And domestically, the Ministry of International Trade and Industry cracked down on cheap junk, introducing strict quality standards. Only goods that passed state inspection could bear the stamp "Made in Japan." It wasn't just about producing better products, it was about rehabilitating the image and identity of the nation. Soft power through global marketing, a marriage of government resources and private industry. And yet, in this early phase, Japan's official cultural exports focused on high arts and economic prestige, and not for the most part on mass media. Anime and manga, still fringe subcultures at the time, were almost totally absent from this first wave of soft power diplomacy. But culture has a way of slipping through the cracks of official policy, And by the 80s and 90s, anime, manga, and video games once dismissed as niche and lowbrow were becoming Japan's most beloved global exports. Anime, though, is messy. It's not a no mask or a cherry blossom garden, or for that matter, a dump truck. Anime, as we discussed, can be quite emotional, and thus, in the early 2000s, Japan's cultural diplomacy pivoted. Rather than just exporting tea ceremonies or cherry blossoms, it would promote pop culture, anime, J-pop, street fashion, and video games as national brand assets, as cultural ambassadors for the nation. The marketing shifted from tech and traditional Japan to pop culture Japan, to cool Japan. In 2010, the Japanese government, under the direction of the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, or METI, started the Cool Japan Initiative. The goal was simple: promote Japanese pop culture internationally through subsidies, overseas media partnerships, and cultural expos, even if it costs more to subsidize than it yields in return. Programs and subsidies provided with the express and stated purpose of increasing Japanese soft power, such as JLOP, the Japan Content Localization and Promotion Support Fund, launched, subsidizing localization and international marketing of anime, manga, music, and games. JLOP Plus expanded those efforts, funding not just translations but international pop culture events. JLOX replaced JLOP Plus with a stronger focus on digital distribution, putting anime on streaming platforms, expanding marketing abroad, and preserving Japan's cultural competitiveness against rising challengers. This list, of course, is not exhaustive. The push didn't just stop at streaming rights and merchandise. In 2016, for example, the Japanese government helped launch the Anime Tourism Association, a public-private partnership whose goal was to map real-world locations tied to anime series and turn them into formal tourist destinations. Literal sites of pilgrimage for devoted otaku, with anime merchandise gift shops finding their ways even into train stations. Anime wasn't just media anymore, it became physical infrastructure, emotional engagement, became real-world economic policy. Why does Netflix have so much anime? Well, it's not just consumer demand, it's also the result of years of Japanese government efforts and subsidies, building an international ecosystem where anime could flourish abroad, even as those subsidies produced a net economic loss for Japan. This video might not be brought to you by Crunchyroll, but Crunchyroll is brought to you by subsidies. Not direct funding, mind you, but through the deliberate expansion of an ecosystem designed to make anime a global force. Don't take my word for it. Here's a report from the Japanese Prime Minister's office, specifically from the Intellectual Property Strategy HQ dated June 4th, 2024. I've linked it in the description so that you can read the whole thing, but nothing I've discussed here is hidden. There's no need to refute what the Japanese government happily tells you outright. Consider, and I quote, "In developing demand for content and other Cool Japan-related fields, it is important to ensure appropriate distribution channels. For instance, with subscription business models for video and music distribution becoming mainstream in the content field, global content distribution channels are becoming increasingly important. But distribution platforms are heavily dependent on major overseas operators without their own global distribution channels, making it difficult for them to strategically cultivate overseas demand based on their own judgment. In the future, it will become more important for them to create their own distribution channels or to secure slots in existing distribution channels through equity participation or other means and collaborate with them to proactively utilize existing distribution channels." For those of us who care, this is literally Japan talking about the need to secure cloud capital, but that's a video for another day maybe. We'll also get to footnote 38 in just a moment. Moving on, to ensure these domestic and international distribution channels, Cool Japan Fund Incorporated has been investing in various platform projects. Specifically, investments have been made in locations such as retail outlets, digital platforms, and wholesale supply chains to serve as bridgeheads for domestic businesses to cultivate demand from local consumers overseas. These efforts have contributed to the branding and demand development of local products in Europe and the development of demand for Japanese sake in China, resulting in a ripple effect, a priming effect, and other overall policy benefits. Let's return to footnote 38 for a second. It states, for instance, Sony Group Incorporated acquired Crunchyroll, an American animation distribution platform, in 2021 to promote its overseas expansion, indicating that some of them are making efforts through their own distribution channels. Let's conclude our discussion of this document with a final snippet, and I quote, Although Cool Japan Incorporated has issues to improve in terms of profitability, as mentioned above, it is further critical to create and secure global distribution channels while achieving leverage through investments in other means. It is necessary to take steps to maximize policy effects, including cooperation with related institutions, while monitoring the progress of the organization's achievement of its policy and profitability goals. Take note of the wording like a lawyer does, right? Policy and profitability goals are separated. They are different. Profit is secondary. Policy effects, quote unquote, should be maximized. And what policy effects do they mean? Well, there's a helpful diagram included for us that states in no unclear terms exactly what the Japanese government wants to maximize. Page 22, Introdocument 19. Enhance Japan's brand, in quotations, soft power. In my last video, I had quite a few people stating that the whole soft power thing was ridiculous. Please then, get your eyes off the cave wall and look at the exact words of the Japanese government. The foremost policy goal of pushing anime was, is, and remains soft power. Herein though lies a problem. Coolness, true cultural resonance, doesn't come from bureaucrats or policy papers. Anime, manga, and games initially succeeded abroad not because they were polished products of national branding, but precisely because they were so messy and real. They carried vulnerability and realness, and people around the world related to that even if they couldn't put it into words. Anime and its peripherals became an effective tool of soft power. But Cool Japan was widely criticized, domestically and internationally, for being clunky, inefficient, wasteful, and fundamentally missing the point, though I would argue, once again, that critics who see only the economic side of the equation are themselves missing the bigger picture. And while these critics might not be paying close enough attention to the details, I can tell you who was. Other nations were taking notes on Japan's cultural rise. They had seen the power of God and anime, and soon, they would use the lessons Japan learned to tell stories of their own, building a foundation for their own soft power and capturing hearts and minds as they went. On July 12, 1979, disco, allegedly, died. It was Disco Demolition Night at Comiskey Park in Chicago, a riot disguised as a baseball promotion where disco records were blown up in the outfield as tens of thousands of onlookers cheered. Racism, xenophobia, homophobia, and cultural backlash collided, and disco, it seems, was the victim. But in truth, disco never died, it simply moved. In Europe, disco evolved into Italo disco and Eurobeat. In Brazil, it transformed into Brazilian boogie, a vibrant form of electro-funk. And in Japan, disco transformed like a magical girl into one of my favorite genres of music, city pop. City pop wasn't just a genre, it was an aspiration. It was the color of Tokyo neon, smooth synthesizers, heart-melting saxophone solos, and songs about unrequited love, late-night drives along the shore, and dancing away your heartbreak. City pop captured the optimism, the youthfulness, the energy of an urbanizing and globalizing Japan, a Japan newly rich from its post-war economic miracle. It was disco, reimagined for a country inventing its own version of the future, a future it had worked half a century to forge. Artists like Junko Ohashi, Miki Matsubara, Anri, and Maria Takeuchi took disco and adapted it and refined it into something uniquely Japanese, glossy yet nostalgic, cosmopolitan and yet underneath all of the glamour, also quietly vulnerable. Throughout the 1980s and into the early 1990s, city pop and the consumer culture it celebrated, the luxury cars, the fashionable gadgets, the glitzy urban life, helped define Japan's international image, futuristic, clean, and desirable. Through music, fashion, and lifestyle exports, Japan was selling not just products but a feeling, a vibe, a Japanese dream that maybe other countries might just want to buy into. It was a bubble of prosperity that had reached untold heights, and yet, no bubble lasts forever. I won't get too deep into the Plaza Accord, the 1985 agreement between the US and other powers meant to weaken the dollar, which crippled Japan, or the bursting of the bubble economy, as I've covered it a few times before in prior videos. All we need to know for the purposes of this video is that the economic miracle ended with a sudden fall. Wages stagnated, businesses shuttered, and housing prices collapsed. It was as if someone had turned the lights on at the club. The glossy dreams of city pop began to feel hollow and increasingly far away. From the ashes of city pop rose J-pop, but where city pop was smooth and cosmopolitan, crooned and full of flaws that come with beautiful human vulnerability, J-pop was quite the opposite. It was hyper-produced, hyper-localized, and tightly controlled by powerful talent agencies like Johnny and Associates or Hello Project. J-pop was vibrant, yes, but it was increasingly insular and designed first and foremost for a domestic audience. J-pop had some niche popularity abroad, but its cultural cautiousness, its reluctance to innovate beyond Japan's borders, prevented it from exploding onto the global stage the way anime eventually would. The recipe for global success was there, it just hadn't been capitalized on. Meanwhile, across the sea, another country in the midst of its own cultural awakening was watching very, very closely. On August 15, 1945, Japan's colonial rule over Korea ended. And yet the scars of cultural erasure remained. During the occupation, the Japanese had attempted to culturally eradicate Korean culture and replace that culture with its own. In response, post-war South Korea implemented strict cultural protection measures. By 1948, these restrictions were codified into law. South Korea banned the import and distribution of Japanese movies, music, literature, and broadcasts. As such, even as Japanese culture boomed abroad in the 70s and 80s, Korea remained closed. And yet anime in particular managed to sneak under the wall. Korean studios often subcontracted to animate Japanese series, sometimes rebranded anime content for local broadcast without acknowledging its origins. Korean viewers fell in love with shows like Mazinger Z and Candy Candy, sometimes without realizing that they were Japanese at all. And thus, despite policy, anime had made its way into the hearts of Korean children. In 1997, the Asian financial crisis devastated South Korea's economy, and Korean policymakers came then to the same conclusion that Japan had reached decades prior. Industry alone was not sufficient. Korea needed cultural exports. It needed soft power. The seeds had already been planted. In 1994, South Korea's Presidential Advisory Board on Science and Technology published a white paper noting that Jurassic Park had earned more global revenue than the sale of 1.5 million Hyundai cars. This revelation sparked a national conversation about the potential of cultural industries, and yet it wasn't until the financial crash that real action began. In 1998, President Kim Dae-jung, arguably South Korea's most competent leader, enacted a policy of cultural liberalization, which occurred in 4 phases starting in 1998 and concluding in 2004. In 1998, Korean policies shifted to allow some Japanese media such as manga and internationally awarded films to enter the country. In 1999, small live performances of Japanese music were allowed with strict limitations. In the year 2000, restrictions eased further. Video games were permitted and animated feature films that had won international awards were allowed in theaters. And finally, in 2004, the cultural ban was mostly lifted. All music and video games could be sold by retailers, all films could be shown in theaters, though TV broadcasting rights for Japanese content, especially anime and music, remained restricted until the late 2000s. And even today, remnants of cultural hesitancy remain in the form of censorship. In parallel, Kim Dae-jung's administration launched a full-scale effort to build Korea's own cultural industry. Thus began arguably the most ambitious soft power initiative in modern history, what observers have come to call the Hallyu, the Korean Wave. In 1998, as President Kim Dae-jung pushed cultural liberalization and permitted access to Japanese cultural goods, he also prioritized a new cultural industry promotion plan with the express purpose of supporting cultural production. laws were passed in the late 90s and early 2000s, such as the Basic Law for the Promotion of Cultural Industries and the Framework Act on the Promotion of Cultural Industries. Government subsidy poured into film, television, and music production companies. Broadband internet infrastructure was massively expanded, and entertainment companies like SMYG and JYP received not just investment, but often indirect government support through training programs, export initiatives, and trade agreements. The result was almost immediate. Korean dramas, K-dramas like What is Love and Winter Sonata were massive hits in China, Taiwan, Vietnam, and even Japan. Winter Sonata alone sparked a craze amongst Japanese housewives that was popularly called Yonsama fever. But a second, even larger wave was just beyond the horizon, the veritable tsunami that is K-pop. With deliberate government-backed strategies, Korean entertainment companies refined the tools of J-pop. The idols, the boy and girl bands, the dancing, and even the fashion. They polished the already hyper-produced sound to a mirror sheen. They pushed their performers harder and more ruthlessly than had ever been the case with J-pop, and they made their music more adaptable, built not just for domestic consumption but specifically for export, with strategic multilingual releases for the Japanese, Chinese, and English markets. K-pop stars were used as state-sponsored cultural ambassadors to build not only a foreign market, but soft power influence for Korea. None of this was by accident. None of this was just the free market left to its own devices. As James Kang, the chief executive of Singapore's Mode Entertainment states, the South Korean strategy for world domination is a lethal combination of meticulous preparation, persistence, ambition, and hard work. While the Japanese market left to its own devices leaned on nostalgia and pulled inward, unable to take risks without money, the Korean market, driven by massive government investment and direction, embraced innovation and globalization. The government ate the risk of expansion. And the results are obvious today, right? BTS and Blackpink are some of the biggest music brands in the world. I've had Cupid by 50/50 stuck in my head for the past 2 weeks. But it's not just music. Japanese cinema and television were targeted and subsumed by Korean cultural products as well. Everyone knows Parasite and Squid Game, and K-dramas today dominate streaming platforms globally, while J-dramas, once influential, have largely faded into niche status. Korean cultural exports dominate global conversations, and they built that dominance on the foundation that the Japanese laid, but never fully realized. And when the Japanese government saw J-pop, J-dramas, and other Japanese cultural products eclipsed by Korean products, they saw what Japan could have had, but failed to grasp. Japan may be playing catch-up now against Korea when it comes to music, fashion, and dramas, but there is still one domain where Japan maintains an undisputed lead: in anime, manga, and video games. In China, this cluster of products is often referred to as ACG, anime, comics, and games. The term ACG first emerged in Chinese vernacular in the late 1990s and early 2000s as Japanese pop culture flooded into the country following the economic reforms of the 1980s and China's entry into the World Trade Organization in 2001. Chinese audiences encountered anime series like Doraemon and Dragon Ball for the first time. They read One Piece and played on their Nintendo consoles. ACG developed then into more than just a nomenclative term. It became an ideal. A catch-all for the colorful, emotional style that Japan had so successfully exported. Yet while Japan was the master of ACG and Korea was preparing to seize the global spotlight with music and television, China in the late 90s and early 2000s was still on the sidelines. Coming out of the hardships of the Cultural Revolution and having only tentatively opened its economy in the 1980s under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping, China didn't have the resources or international credibility to compete in the cultural soft power arena in the ways its neighbors could. In 1990, China had a GDP per capita of only $317 US. At the time, Nigeria's GDP per capita was nearly twice as much at $556 US. China was, only very recently, one of the poorest countries in the world. China was a developing country focused on manufacturing, infrastructure, and lifting hundreds and millions of people out of poverty. In other words, the Communist Party had more pressing priorities. But as reforms began to bear fruit, and with China's entry into the World Trade Organization, China began its own economic miracle. Chinese cities became massive global trade hubs, Chinese products flooded into markets all over the globe, and foreign investment poured in. Chinese companies rose to prominence in manufacturing, tech, and finance, but a crucial piece of the puzzle was missing. Economic success alone was not sufficient. Industry was not enough. The CCP realized, just like Japan after World War II and Korea after the Asian financial crisis, that China needed more than just prosperity. It needed soft power. To that end, at the 17th National Congress of the Chinese Communist Party, President Hu Jintao made Wenhua Ran Sili an official national objective: cultural soft power. And what followed was a massive wave of targeted policies, including subsidies for film, animation, publishing, and tech startups, global outreach programs through institutions like the Confucius Institutes, and aggressive investments into Hollywood studios, video game companies, and international streaming platforms. But ambition alone was not enough. China's cultural industries were still relatively young and burdened with censorship and political restrictions, and Korea had already begun securing dominance in music, television, and film by the early 2000s. The Chinese then faced a difficult question: where could they compete? And the answer, it turns out, was ACG, anime, comics, and games. Anime and manga were already wildly popular amongst Chinese youth, despite decades of cultural censorship. Chinese ACG had a foundation to build on, and as early investments and experiments bore fruit, official policy soon followed. The Ministry of Culture's 2010 to 2012 strategic plan, for example, specifically organized development of animation, online games, and digital comics as core strategic industries for China's future. Subsidies flowed into animation studios, comic platforms, and mobile gaming companies. ACG was no longer just about entertainment, it was a national strategy, designed not only to capture a market, but to develop Chinese soft power by capturing hearts and minds. Where Hollywood films demanded huge budgets and K-pop demanded brutal perfectionism, ACG offered lower barriers to entry and an extant captive audience already attuned to the aesthetics and language of anime and games. Platforms like Bilibili, originally founded as an anime streaming site modeled after Japan's Nico Nico, were not only merely tolerated but eventually integrated into China's broader cultural export plans. In its early years, Bilibili was almost like a shrine to Japanese pop culture. Anime music videos, fan-made parodies, and imported anime series dominated the landscape. But over time, Bilibili evolved. It fostered original Chinese animation and launched its own gaming initiatives. It cultivated a domestic industry. It wasn't just importing ACG anymore, it was building a Chinese version of ACG, one designed to project cultural influence on top of the language, aesthetics, and infrastructure that Japan had already built and exported around the globe. Bilibili was a beachhead for a Chinese entrance into an East Asian war for soft power. But it wasn't alone. Platforms like Douyin, TikTok emerged alongside it, not focusing on anime specifically, but operating under the same basic principle, opening a cultural battleground in the space of emotional, youth-driven digital media, but built on top of the soft power initiatives that already existed. Korea is happy to let TikTok broadcast its soft power initiatives to the world, and China is happy to use Korea's soft power as fuel for the fire of its own cloud capital furnace. In this way, China can dominate digital spaces where Korea and Japan had already found success, and thereby ensure that the next wave of global entertainment will be built, at least in part, on Chinese terms.
Modern life is so thin and shallow and fake. I look forward to when developers go bankrupt, Japan gets poorer, and wild grasses take over. Hayao Miyazaki.
For decades, Japan reigned supreme as Asia's cultural powerhouse. From the Walkman to Dragon Ball, from PlayStation to Studio Ghibli, Japan's soft power felt untouchable. But today, that iron grip is loosening. Japan is fighting a two-front war and losing ground on both sides. On one side, Korea has already overtaken Japan in key sectors like music, fashion, and television. Where J-pop was once poised to go global, it retreated inward, clinging to domestic nostalgia and unable to take risks abroad without the backing of government subsidy. K-pop, meanwhile, was purpose-built for export, backed by massive state investment to eat risk, multilingual production, and brutal idol training systems. Korean dramas, once derivative of Japanese television formats, have now decisively surpassed them. Even white stay-at-home moms living in the middle of nowhere upstate New York are joining K-drama fan communities and learning Korean. Korea dominates the TV drama and pop music global stage, a stage that Japan once ruled. And on the other side, China is advancing. China doesn't merely want to compete with Japan's dominance over anime, comics, and games, it wants to surpass it, and it is rapidly making progress. In 2010, 6 out of the top 10 video game companies by revenue were Japanese: Nintendo, Sony Computer Entertainment, Bandai Namco, Sega, Konami, and Square Enix. At present, only Sony and Nintendo remain. Tencent, NetEase, and MiHoYo, all Chinese companies, have since joined the top 10, with Tencent having held the global #1 gaming revenue position for several years, only recently overtaken by Sony's PlayStation 5 surge. Outside of the top 10, the landscape is equally grim. Nexon, a Korean firm headquartered in Japan, competes directly with Square Enix. Shanghai-based 37 Games, almost unknown outside of Asia, ranks higher than Sega in global revenue. And Krafton, Netmarble, and NCSoft, all Korean giants, are not that far behind. Tencent isn't just some game company either. Sony is, at time of recording, the 97th largest corporation on Earth, with a market cap of around $152 billion. Tencent is number 16, with a market cap of roughly $562 billion. That's almost twice the market cap of Samsung, and more than 3 times larger than Disney. Tencent owns 100% of Riot Games, which means League of Legends and Valorant. Did you enjoy Arcane? Is it one of your greatest of all-time animated marvels? Did it touch your heart? Well, that's what it was designed to do. Here's my hottest take of the video. Arcane is a cigarette commercial. It plays with your emotions, makes you feel things, tells you an incredible story you can get invested in, all to sell you, at the end of the day, League of Legends, gaming's closest equivalent to lung cancer.
Marlboro country.
Tencent also has a 40% stake in Epic Games, which means a 40% stake in both the Unreal Engine and in Fortnite. 30% in Larian Studios, which means 30% of Baldur's Gate 3, 13.9% of Krafton, the owners of PUBG, 5% of Activision Blizzard, 80% of Grinding Gear Games, which is to say Path of Exile, 14% of Remedy, 84% in Supercell, the devs behind Clash of Clans, 13.5% in Korean developer Kakao, 10% of Paradox Interactive, 11% of Ubisoft, known best for Hooters Road Trip, and undisclosed amounts of both Platinum Games and Discord, amongst many other investments. Tencent even owns 16.25% of FromSoft. Kadokawa wanted funds to expand FromSoft and struck a deal with Sony. Unbeknownst to many, though, it was actually a deal between Sony, Kadokawa, and Tencent via Tencent's subsidiary Sixjoy. Sony only got 14.09%, which is less than what Tencent walked away with. And it wasn't just investment. Over the past decade, Tencent and NetEase have poured money into Japanese studios, buying minority stakes, supporting expansions, and outright poaching key creative figures. Toshihiro Nagoshi, creator of the Yakuza series, now leads NetEase's new Nagoshi studio. Toshimichi Mori of BlazBlue was also recruited after departing Arc System Works. But recently, both Tencent and NetEase have begun strategically scaling back international investments, particularly in Japan, amidst both Beijing's tightening capital controls, an economic downturn in China, and perhaps a quiet recognition that destabilizing rival creative ecosystems can yield soft power advantages down the line. Kadokawa wouldn't need Tencent or Sony if they could count on the Japanese government, which, as we will see, is part of why Japan is struggling to keep up. But I digress. In the realm of comics, Korean comics dominate digital formats. Webtoon, owned by Korea's Naver, is now the largest digital comics platform in the world. Chinese manhwa through Tencent Comics and Bilibili Comics is aggressively expanding into the US and Southeast Asia. And in the realm of animation, Chinese animated films are breaking records. Chang'an Sanwenli shattered box office records for animated films in China, outperforming Japanese imports and Disney alike. Deep Sea Sinhai wowed critics with its dreamlike storytelling. Neiza 2 very recently became the first animated film to ever surpass $2 billion at the global box office, and it did so in only 52 days. Check what the critics have to say too. Just about everyone who's watched the film seems to have nothing but extremely high praise for it. Chinese and Korean studios aren't just subcontractors anymore. Their scale and production quality can rival that of even the largest Japanese animation studios. Wit Studio, the Japanese studio behind Spy X Family and Attack on Titan, has about 200 employees. Light Chaser Animation in Beijing, 300 to 400, and growing. Anime, manga, and video games are no longer Japan's unassailable cultural fortress. The Koreans and Japanese have circled the city and the walls have come tumbling down. Japan's government is stuck in a position where it needs to spend massively to subsidize the cultural industries it has staked its entire economic livelihood upon, but it has no more gas in the tank left to do so. Japan already has, as of the recording of this video, the highest debt to GDP ratio of any country in the world, at around 260% as of time of writing. Put more simply, Japan has 2.5 times more debt than its entire annual economic output. And this is nothing new. Japan has had a debt to GDP ratio running above 200% for the past 5 years. To give you some context here, the United States is in the top 10 for highest debt to GDP ratio, and it sits at 124% as of December of 2024. Japan overtook second place Sudan in 2025. Its bond yields are spiking as well, with the Japanese 40-year government bond yield spiking past 3% to an all-time high just recently, meaning it is getting more and more expensive for a debt-laden Japan to borrow money. In May of 2025, not long before the publication of this video, Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba called the nation's financial conditions worse than Greece's, directly referencing Greece's financial crisis. A crisis which one might recall was so severe that it shook the entire Eurozone. Greece's debt to GDP ratio, by the way, remains one of the highest in the world at 149% as of early 2025. Japan's is higher by no less than 100 percentage points. How is this worse than Greece-Japan supposed to compete in subsidies and soft power against China and South Korea, or even Taiwan? The IMF estimates that as of 2025, both Taiwan and South Korea now have a higher GDP per capita than Japan. A notion that was simply unthinkable 20 years ago, never mind 30 or 40 years ago. If this trajectory continues, Portugal will have a higher GDP per capita than Japan by 2026. The Japanese government is scraping the barrel and throwing whatever it can at a last-ditch effort to recover its footing and take back its dominance in ACG and pop culture as a whole through massive subsidies. But with the Japanese economy squeezed to its very limits, how can Japanese companies, even with massive subsidies, hope to compete and take risks against South Korea or China? Why, one need only look at the UI and presentation of Fate Grand Order and compare it to a game like Honkai Star Rail to see how stark the disparity is. It's not just laziness, it's risk management. Japanese publishers don't have the state financial backing to take the risks they need to take to properly emerge into global markets, and certainly not in the ways that China or Korea have. And thus you have the situation with Kadokawa, Sony, and Tencent. Kadokawa cannot count on public support to expand, so it has to turn to private equity. This dynamic incentivizes Japanese companies to stick with what they know works and to not rock the boat. It is here then that our discussion finally at long last comes full circle. Why do Chinese and Korean gacha games present themselves as Japanese? Well, let's put our gems together and pull. In the year 2010, 3 computer science students studying at Shanghai Jiao Tong University came together and developed an isometric, tile-based game engine using Adobe Flash Player called Misato Engine. These 3 students, Cai Hallyu, Liu Wei, and Luo Yuhao, were self-proclaimed otaku, so much so that they named their Misato engine after Katsuragi Misato, a character from Neon Genesis Evangelion. In January of 2011, the 3 students set up their own game studio with dreams of making a smash hit. They decided to name the company Hoyo. The H and the Y were taken from the first letters of Hallyu and Yuhao's names, and the O's were added because, according to Cai, Liu, and Luo, many famous tech companies like Google and Facebook have O's in their name. But when the 3 went to register their company, they discovered that Hoyo had already been taken, so they added Mi to it and named the company MiHoYo. Where did the Mi come from, you might ask? Well, Liu Wei personally explained that at a 2019 campus recruitment event at Zhejiang University. The Mi in MiHoYo comes from, and I kid you not, Hatsune Miku. MiHoYo launched its first game, Fly Me to the Moon, on September 28, 2011 on the Apple App Store. It was a puzzle game about a magical girl flying to the moon, and the name comes from the ending theme song of, once again, Neon Genesis Evangelion. The game's original music, titled Moon Trip, was composed by Chinese Vocaloid music producer Yu Jianlu. Naturally, Yu used the Miku voice bank for the song. I won't go into the whole history of MiHoYo here, we'll save that for another video. But from the outset you can see that there doesn't seem to be anything sinister here, right? There's no grand soft power scheme, there's no boardrooms crunching numbers. It's just 3 kids painting with borrowed colors, making games out of the stories and songs that had once brought them joy. A group of Chinese students raised on the emotional grammar of Japanese ACG who then learned to emulate it. And the outcome wasn't cultural imitation, but cultural inheritance. Just as Tezuka once drew inspiration from Princess Iron Fan and turned his inspiration into something uniquely Japanese, so too did MiHoYo and its peers absorb the Japanese emotional vocabulary that emerged from anime to create something new. Indeed, across China and Korea, across the whole world even, an entire generation of creatives took the tools that Japan had developed, and when Japan hesitated, when Japan turned inwards, when Japan clung to nostalgia rather than adaptation and conservatism over progress, they picked up the tools that Japan had left behind and built new empires with them. Yet the master's tools can never dismantle the master's house, and in the case of MiHoYo, what started as an innocent group of students making games inspired by anime ended up railroaded into one of the largest companies in the entire video game industry. And such a massive company casts a very large cultural shadow. MiHoYo's own description of Genshin Impact reads as follows: Genshin Impact combines an anime-influenced cartoonish style that emphasizes a lively aesthetic with natural features and key elements of culture that evoke China. You won't find that description in the English language marketing, but it sure is there in the Chinese language marketing. And consider MiHoYo's motto, its slogan, Tech Otakus Save the World. At first glance, it reads like a mere self-aware wink and a nod to a generation that was raised on Evangelion and Miku, paired with the promise that technology might make the world a better and happier place. But in light of everything we've discussed, this motto carries a deeper, more bitter truth. As Miyazaki states, and as the popularity of isekai or otherworld fiction suggests, the so-called tech otaku barely even lives in this world. Their hearts belong somewhere else. How then can the otaku hope to save the world when they can barely even comprehend it, when their understanding of other people, of relationships, of emotions, are like shadows on the cave wall? Illusions being projected by companies selling them feelings and identity for profit. In the digital age, real intimacy is hard. We receive constant glimpses into the manicured and curated lives of others, which leaves our own lives feeling small. We become background characters in our own stories, in our own waking lives. And yet, there is no main character but you. You are the protagonist of your own life, not a side character in anyone else's. But that's a lot of work, that's a lot of hardship and hurt and rejection and discomfort. It is so much easier, isn't it, to be the main character in someone else's story, a story sold to you where the affection is scripted and the friendships are paywalled. MiHoYo and its contemporaries understand that. It's not enough to dress their games in doe eyes and pastel palettes. It is not enough to add an arbitrary Japanese area to the map or add Japanese voice acting. All of it is but a signifier of something more, of the emotional machinery that Japan had spent decades refining, because anime is more than a style, it is an entire system of feeling, of emotion. Anime once whispered to a broken generation of Japanese youth, "You are not alone." Now it proclaims, "You are needed, you are special, you are chosen, but only if you can afford the next poll." In that sense, MiHoYo and its contemporaries didn't save the world, they conquered it. And they did so without an army, without force, and without violence. Why then do Chinese and Korean gacha games pretend to be Japanese? It's because anime, through soft power initiatives, has become the Japanese aesthetic. And the anime industry has constructed a framework of emotional grammar that is familiar and emotionally resonant to hundreds of millions, if not billions of people around the world. The mere use of anime aesthetics becomes a shortcut to trust, a performance of authenticity that gives one access to a vast, preconditioned and captive audience, fluent in a fantasy of affection, an illusion of intimacy without the discomfort of reciprocity. Yet to hone in on anime's emotionality is not sufficient. The modern anime industry is nothing short of commercially engineered emotional manipulation. Anime has taught a generation of otaku a facsimile of human emotions. How to cry, yearn, and love in that exaggerated performative way, but also how to build an identity around and purchase merchandise associated with those feelings. Gacha games like Genshin or Love in Deep Space or Blue Archive or Nikkei take it even one step further, selling you a friend, an admirer, or even a lover which you pay for not only with your currency, but with your heart. And where hearts can be bought and minds won over, so too shall there be state actors looking for opportunity. Anime is arguably Japan's most successful cultural export, the brightest jewel in its soft power crown. But anime as an aesthetic is easy to poach and co-opt. When a Korean game then ships with Japanese voice acting or a Chinese game ships with a Japanese name, it isn't just a design decision, it is geopolitical cosplay. And what enables that cosplay and allows these Chinese and Korean media companies to take risks that Japanese companies cannot, or at least once weren't able to, is state sponsorship that builds an underlying infrastructure for global engagement, in part to seize market share from an economic rival, but just as much so to place Korea or China at the center of the otaku's heart, where Japan used to be. And in so doing, these other countries can hijack Japan's cultural trust, its emotional branding, and redirect it to their own industries and own ambitions. A Korean wave, or a Chinese century, built atop the ruins of a Japanese miracle. People who design machines and airplanes, no matter how much they believe that what they do is good, the winds of time eventually turn them into tools of industrial civilization. It's never unscathed. They are cursed dreams. Animation, too. Today, all of humanity's dreams are cursed somehow. Beautiful, yet cursed dreams. Hayao Miyazaki. There is no ethical consumption under capitalism. This isn't a radical stance, it is simply the truth of the world that we live in. Ethical consumption requires context and understanding, but there are so many moving parts, there is so much hidden complexity that even the simplest act of consumption relies, in some capacity, on exploitation. Indeed, the wellspring of wealth in a capitalist system is not innovation, but exploitation, though as we've seen, exploitation can certainly be innovated upon. Throughout this video, I've painted a rather dour picture of anime, of manga, of video games, and especially of gacha games. If you're a weeb, otaku, or even just a regular anime fan, I understand that you might be feeling a little vulnerable right now. Mooney's telling me to abandon the things that I love. No. Look, I'm not asking you to forsake the things that bring you joy. We are living in a material world and we are all but material girls. Participate in the world around you, lest you end up a grouchy hermit or fool on the hill. An embittered soul who might understand all things but who cannot relate enough to anybody to share that understanding. You can and maybe even should enjoy the things you love, so long as you do so with an awareness of what that love and consumption means, and what effects it has on yourself and others. I myself dabble in the occasional gacha game. I played a bit of Reverse 1999 relatively recently and I enjoyed it very much. But I'm just playing games. I know that's plastic love. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Enjoy your gacha games, but don't be a gamer. Listen to K-pop, but don't be a stan, and by all means, watch anime, but don't be an otaku. If you are still chained to the wall, watching multi-billion-dollar companies parade shadows of reality in front of you, then I invite you to step out of the cave with me. You have nothing to lose but your chains. In the midst of all this commodified emotional manipulation and otaku fantasy, there is a silver lining. Japan may have laid the foundation of ACG, but as Korea and China continue to develop their own styles, ACG is no longer purely Japanese. It's becoming something broader, something East Asian, maybe even something universal. The Chinese artist drawing in an anime style or the Korean singer experimenting with J-hip-hop aren't just appropriating or copying Japanese culture, they're speaking a shared cultural language. When Blue Archive, a Korean-developed game, is published by a Chinese publisher first in Japan, it doesn't just build market credibility, it creates interconnectivity. When Apothecary Diaries, a Japanese light novel, is set in the Chinese Tang Dynasty and becomes Japan's most wanted anime adaptation, bridges are being built. Yes, there's still competition. Yes, there are still old wounds and old hostilities. But trade between Japan, Korea, and China is growing. Diplomacy, however fraught, continues to normalize and improve. And culture, soft power, has mended divides that seemed politically impossible just 30 years prior. Who knows, maybe one day, old rivals will once again be as sisters. Maybe one day, the soft power war will truly end, and we can all beat these swords into plowshares for good. And when that day comes, maybe we will walk through a cherry blossom garden together, one that belongs not to China, or Korea, or Japan, but to us all. I've been your host, Mooney. This video was a monumental effort, and I sincerely hope that you found it enjoyable and insightful. You may have noticed that despite the video's length, it does not have a sponsor. That is a purposeful decision. Although they make up a lion's share of the channel's revenue, I've been looking to slowly phase out sponsored videos. There are more important things than money, and even well-intentioned sponsorships can affect the authenticity and meaningfulness of the content that I want to make for you. That said, if you enjoy this kind of content and you'd like to see more, I encourage you to check out and support Moon Channel on Patreon. We've even got a new Discord for patrons and YouTube members. Moon Channel also donates 10% of its gross revenue to charity, with receipts that you can see on Moon Channel's community page. It's a way of both showing how much good your support is doing, while also allowing me to be transparent with all of you about Moon Channel's income. A special thanks then to Moon Channel contributor and team member Larita Shine for her assistance in writing, for the lovely thumbnail and art, and for the voice acting. To my buddy Tracer for his assistance in voice acting. To Ulysses for help in script review, and to Moon Channel's dearly beloved patrons, without whom none of this would be possible. And last but not least, thank you for tuning in to Moon Channel. So you made it to the end of this 2-hour marathon video. That's quite an achievement. On behalf of Moon Channel's Discord server and patrons, please accept the following message.
Congratulations.
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 Thank you all.
Parabéns.